And joining us now on the debate in Vancouver, British Columbia, Paul Wells, columnist with Maclean's magazine. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, David Matus, lawyer and board member for Rights and Democracy. In Montreal, Quebec, Payam Akhavan, law professor at McGill University, who was also a board member at Rights and Democracy until he stepped down early last month. And here in studio, Chris Selley, member of the editorial board with the National Post. Good of all of you to join us tonight for this discussion. And Paul, I guess you're probably the only journalist in Vancouver who's on TV today not talking about the Olympics. So we're really glad you went away from all of that fun to join us tonight. Let me read something.
The only man in Vancouver wearing a suit, yeah.
Exactly. Let me start by reading something that Andrew Cohen wrote in the Ottawa Citizen, because there's a lot of background of this story that I think we need to know before we can start. This is a pretty good summary. Get comfortable, everybody. I'm going to read this and then we'll come back and chat. For years, we heard nothing about Rights and Democracy, as it's called, the arm's-length agency of the federal government that was established by Parliament in 1988. Perhaps it was doing the Lord's work in the world's most dangerous places, bringing freedom to the oppressed. Perhaps it was an unsung, influential arm of foreign policy, hiding its light under a barn, which would be very Canadian. Whatever, you can't say that about it anymore. The embattled agency has had more publicity in the last month than in the previous 20 years. None has been good. How dramatic does political theater get in Canada? Try recrimination, resignation, tragedy. A slide into chaos, the Globe and Mail artlessly calls it. By now, many know about the internecine warfare at the agency. It features a power struggle among the directors, a rebellion among the staff, and the death of the president, Remy Beauregard, who had a heart attack after a long incendiary meeting on January 7th, during which his leadership was called into question. He died that night. The dispute erupted in July over the awarding of grants to human rights groups in the Middle East. Members of the board resigned, and the government appointed others. Trench warfare through the media followed. Paul, you've done a lot of the reporting on this as well, so I do want to go to you first. Tell us what, in your view, are the key important facts for us to know as it relates to this story.
Well, around the beginning of 2009, the government started to appoint board members to Rights and Democracy who were, it became clear, at odds with the management style of the then President Remy Beauregard. Three of them sent an evaluation of Mr. Beauregard to the federal government, which was sharply critical of his position on several files regarding the Middle East. They wouldn't let him see it, and they sought legal advice at considerable cost to the organization to prop up their position that a job evaluation of the senior employee couldn't be seen by the senior employee. They lost that fight. He got the evaluation, and it became clear that this was essentially an internal struggle over the position of the organization with regard to Israel. During a very stormy board meeting in January, he went home after losing some of these internal struggles. He died in his sleep. And the certain members of the board, Mr. Matus less than some others, have continued to outrageously denigrate the good work he was doing as a pretext for I'm not quite sure what, but there's an odd mix of sort of secret underhanded moves on the one hand, and then blatantly untrue accusations against the dead man on the other, which do none of the participants, including the Government of Canada, any honor.
Okay,
that's the short version.
That is, well, that has helped us and added some more to the record here. David Matus, I guess I should go to you next. You know, you've been on the board for a number of years. You were recently reappointed. You've defended publicly the current board's activities. You've heard what Paul's had to say. Why don't you come back with your view of how things are?
Well, first of all, the whole current board was appointed by the government, and the people who wrote the report were appointed in 2008, not the performance review report, were appointed in 2008, not 2009. There has been, I came in at the end of the day. The president died the first day of the first meeting I attended. But it was not a vitriolic meeting. It was not an incendiary meeting. His leadership was not called into question at the meeting. It was a meeting like many others that I go to. The people were polite and nobody shouted, and so this characterization is wrong. there has been a dispute at Rights and Democracy, but it hasn't been primarily about grants to Middle East organizations. The dispute has been about the performance review of the president, about accountability and transparency. There was criticism of the president in the performance review, which the performance review was entitled, a committee was entitled to make. They wanted to meet with Beauregard, the former president. He didn't go to these meetings. He tried to get the board to withdraw the performance review report. He did get the performance review report from the Privy Council through an access to information request. The committee offered to meet with him to disclose the contents of the report. The legal opinion they got was that you're not supposed to disclose the confidence of the Privy Council, which sounds right to me. What I see is a dispute about the transparency, accountability, the control of the board over the management, escalating into something entirely different, and it's being characterized as a dispute about the Middle East, whereas in fact these Middle Eastern grants, the issue had been solved.
Okay, hold off for a second, Mr. May. Again, lots more added to the record here, and we will get to the Middle East situation in a second. But while we have Payam Akhavan on the program, as someone who, in fact, did resign from the board over what was going on, I want him to add his understanding to the story so far. Go ahead.
I would agree with my dear colleague, Mr. Matis, that this is about accountability and transparency, but it's actually about the accountability and transparency of certain board members vis-a-vis what was then the majority of the board. And of course, this is before Mr. Matis joined the board, so there's much which he was not witness to. The fact is that the majority of the board believed that the performance of Mr. Beauregard was highly satisfactory. He was appointed by the government in order to implement recommendations that were made by the Auditor General. And both the ministers in Ottawa and the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament and the majority of the board was satisfied with his performance. The question is why a minority, in this case 3 board members, including the chair, decided to write a secret report which was not disclosed either to the president or to the majority of the board despite repeated requests. And once the contents of the report were made visible, I'm afraid there's only one way to characterize it. It was seen as a smear against the reputation of the president. There were very serious accusations which were simply unfounded. Questions about the ethnic origin of staff, really something which I cannot understand such things happening in a human rights
let's just spell that out. Professor Akhavan, let's just spell that out. There were questions asked about whether or not there were any Jewish members of the staff of this organization.
Well, this has now been reported in the media, and I'm really trying to convey the sense of disbelief with which the majority of the board saw the secretive nature of the decisions of the minority of the board member, the serious accusations being made about the president. So it is a question of transparency and accountability.
Tell me this as well. Why did you resign from the board?
Well, I think that Seema Samar and I reached the point at the final meeting in January of realizing that this organization is being run by like a one-party state. The 7-6 majority that had recently been acquired was making every decision based on block voting, 7-6. It was very clear they were completely disinterested in our views. They already made their mind on all the decisions. And we must remember that in October, a board meeting at which there was still a 6-5 majority on our side, if you wish, was cancelled on 2 days' notice. And the meeting was recalled when the 2 new appointments were made, giving the chair a 7-6 majority. So what we see is a human rights organization in which the board of directors are behaving in a way which is anti-democratic, which does not respect the rights of other board members.
Okay, I got to get Chris in here. Hang on a second, because I want to manage the time well here. Just for the record, Oral Braun is the chair of the board. He's a University of Toronto professor, international relations specialty, very pro-Israel, as is this federal government, and this will all, we'll discuss this more going ahead. Chris, you wrote the editorial in the National Post in which you described this as a sordid saga. In your view, which side of this debate has got more sordid going on than the other?
Wow. Well, I don't know that I can really speak to that. I think when I look at it, the fact that it's a sordid saga just speaks very poorly and casts a lot of negative light on the government's efforts to be more strident in support of Israel and the government's efforts to be seen to be more strident in support of Israel.
Do you think one side is right and one side is wrong in this?
Well, I trust Paul Wells's reporting implicitly, frankly, and to me, the idea that an arm's length organization like this is attempting under some sort of, not control, but under some sort of agenda from the government to turn itself into a more pro-Israeli organization, that makes perfect sense to me in light of what, in light of the government's overall foreign policy objectives. I just don't think, and they're perfectly entitled to pursue those objectives, but I just think it doesn't cast their methods in a very good light at all to see this sordid saga, as I said.
Okay, Paul, follow up with this if you would. This is supposed to be an arm's length organization of the federal government, but of course the federal government appoints the people who are on the board. How much of what's gone on there would you lay at the feet of the federal government, as in it's their responsibility or their fault for all of this having happened?
Well, all of it, but the federal government is giving us a bit of the runaround. Mr. Matus has written, I think, quite intelligently and insightfully and thoughtfully about the contradictions of the sort of arm's length organization that Rights and Democracy was set up to be. It was created to essentially give Canadian governments a kind of plausible deniability. As it went on and did its good work in the face of tyrants around the world, those tyrants would get mad at the federal government if Rights and Democracy was simply a department of the government. That's why CETA wasn't doing this. That's why you set up a sort of a shadow agency. And 20 years later, the world is more sophisticated. Nobody's fooled, and you could have a reasonable, open, frank debate about the structure and role of Rights and Democracy. But what we're getting is a mockery of a reasoned and open and frank debate. What we have is the consummate fake good cop in the federal government, Lawrence Cannon, the foreign minister, protesting that he doesn't know what's going on, and he's had a good conversation with Oral Braun, the board chairman, and I think pretending to believe that Oral Braun can fix the problem when it is an open dispute between Mr. Braun and the staff that is the problem. So what the federal government should do, since it owns this organization, and since it should properly own this organization, is in the light of day, in public, air out the various complaints and the various allegations that are being made, instead of, frankly, both sides leaking to pet reporters, which is what's going on now. If the government is trying in good faith to manage this crisis, it's doing the worst job I could possibly imagine. I can only conclude that it's not trying in good faith to manage this crisis. It is trying to provoke it.
David Matus, can you respond to that?
Well, I was the most recent appointment to the board by the government, along with Michael Van Pelt, and I wasn't given any instructions by the government. Indeed, I've had no conversations with anybody in the government or the Prime Minister's office about Rights and Democracy, except to be asked if I would accept the appointment.
Well, presumably they know you and they know your background and your politics, so they probably don't have to do that. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, sure, but what I was saying before was by the time I got there was no dispute about these Middle East grants. I myself proposed a resolution repudiating those grants. The resolution was passed unanimously, not 7-6. The dispute, I think Payam Akhavan and I, who are both insiders, at least agree on the nature of the dispute, which is it's a governance dispute. It's not a Middle East dispute. And my view is, sure, there were members in the board of directors, maybe even 6-5, who thought differently from the performance review of the performance review committee, but the way the bylaws of the organization works, it's the performance review committee that does the performance review. And they were the ones who interviewed the people, they were the ones who went through the documents, and to say, and they were supposed to report directly to the Privy Council, to say that the board of directors should be able to overrule them, it stymies the legal structure of the organization. And what's more, Remy Beauregard proposed a bylaw amendment that basically would have turned this performance review into a self-evaluation, saying that the president would set the objectives of the review and not the performance review committee. So it really is an issue of who's accountable and the form and transparency of accountability.
I never like to speak for Paul Wells, so I'm going to let him speak for himself. I'm going to read what he wrote, actually, on January 29th about these very issues. The developments at Rights and Democracy happened while Parliament was prorogued. while Stephen Harper continued to hold a minority in the Commons and to command roughly a third of the decided voter allegiance in most polls. 4 years after Harper was elected, Liberals still like to console themselves that he hasn't won a majority. But he now controls a majority on the Rights and Democracy Board, and the Liberals couldn't even slow him down. Harper's government cut funding to Kairos, an interfaith human rights organization. The Millennium Scholarship Foundation ran a flawed student aid program, and with a little money on the side, did the best research in Canada on who gets into university and how much it costs them. The feds have shut that research program down too. Multiply these few decisions by all the appointments and funding choices a government makes. Understand that almost none of them are reviewed by Parliament, and almost none will be noticed by most voters or even most journalists. A government stands or falls on bigger, simpler questions, but having stood and not fallen, it gets to shift these hundreds of levers, not to reward cronies, but to change society. So let me follow up, Payam Akhavan, with you. Is the government not allowed to appoint who they want in the hopes that those people will reflect their views on, quote unquote, changing society?
Well, if there is an arm's length agency with a mandate to promote human rights and democratic development, the government should, within the limits of the mandate of that organization, appoint whoever it deems appropriate. One would hope that the people would have some competence and experience in the field of human rights and democratic development. And one would also hope that while everyone holds a certain political view, that there's not a politicization of the issues.
So are you saying they didn't have the background in human rights?
I would say not.
And overly politicized as well?
I would say that that was what was beginning to emerge as this once minority group began to consolidate its grip and to become a one-vote majority. And I would agree with Mr. Matus that the Middle East is not an issue, but it became an issue over these grants, which in the amount of $10,000 represent less than 0.1% of the organization's $11 million budget. How can one, for example, criticize B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel, and to equate it with toxic organizations? And then after Mr. Beauregard reassures the board that there will be no such further grants in order to address the concerns of the chair, after that there is a secret report accusing him of having ties with Hezbollah and with Hamas, which are completely baseless accusations.
Where do those accusations come from?
I'd like to know. I think perhaps that the authors of the report should have been on this show to explain why they made those accusations. We know that Mr. Beauregard was at a meeting in Cairo of the Arab League on freedom of association. Apparently he addressed an audience of 150 people, of which one who was part of the Lebanese delegation may have belonged to Hezbollah.
Okay, let me get Paul Wells on that. Paul, any idea where those allegations came from? Because they certainly were, in the view of Mr. Beauregard, scurrilous and damaged his reputation.
All I've seen in terms of the specific nature of these allegations is a document in which Beauregard responded to accusations made against him in the hitherto secret report. I haven't seen the report itself. I sent a list of questions to Mr. Braun, the board chairman, and to Mr. Gauthier, the interim president, who also sits on the board. They wrote back several hours after I sent the questions, protesting that I hadn't given them any time to answer. Mr. Gauthier's protestation that I hadn't given him any time to answer arrived 7 hours after I sent the questions. By the time this airs tonight, I will have posted on my website the list of questions. It's now 10 days since I sent them the questions. They're free to answer any time. But instead, they sent out Mr. Matus, who's the nothing to see here guy. He says that this is only about management practice and governance. If that's the case, then I'd like to know why Mr. Braun, in his rare media appearances, cannot stop talking about the grants to these organizations, and why Gerald Steinberg, an academic in Israel, had an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post 4 days after Beauregard passed away, congratulating the federal government for finally standing up for Israel. Jerry Steinberg and Oral Braun seem to think this is about the Middle East.
David Matus?
Well, first of all, there's something I guess I should have responded to before. I've read this performance review, and there's nothing in there about Jewish members on staff, any comments or questions about that. I've read it in the paper, but it's not in the report. I also point out that well, as you mentioned, I was a former member of the board. I was appointed by the previous Liberal government twice. I'm a defeated Liberal candidate. I'm not a Tory hack. In fact, I sort of like hearing criticism of the Tory government. But I wasn't there to realize a Tory agenda. My whole career has been on human rights. I haven't really done anything else. And the notion that I'm the swing vote. So the notion I was brought in without a human rights background to realize the Tory agenda is just a fantasy. I was brought in because of my experience on the board, because there was a dispute, and because of the need to assert the direction of the board against the staff and management that didn't want to take it. Sure, I mean, the media have recharacterized the issue as a Middle East issue, and then we get commentators all over the place saying, I'm on this side of the Middle East, and I'm on that side of the Middle East.
Okay, but hang on. Can I get you to speak to Paul's point, which is, if this really isn't about the Middle East, why is your chairman out there constantly talking about we've finally done the right thing on the Middle East?
Well, I mean, I can't I haven't heard absolutely everything that Oral Braun has said, but and even Gerald Steinberg, I don't know everything that he said. But what I can say is there was these grants in the Middle East. There was concern about them. There was one paragraph in the 16-page performance report about them. As a result of the concern, the president said he wouldn't do it again. The president joined and spoke in favor of a repudiation motion. It's a small problem or a small issue embedded in a much bigger issue.
Okay, let's get Chris. Chris has been waiting very patiently to get in. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think it needs to be said that whatever the facts of what's going on at Rights and Democracy, it very much, the controversy over Israel fits into a much larger narrative that's going on with the government. We've mentioned Kairos, I think, twice. And I think more than anything that went on at Rights and Democracy, Kairos really sort of encapsulated what looks like a very disreputable approach to trying to reorient Canadian foreign policy towards, to be in favor of Israel.
Having said that, I think you've written in your own newspaper that this is the government's position and they're entitled to do it.
It's absolutely their position, and it's absolutely their right to do it. And that's what I think, and that's why I don't understand why, when there are so many people out there who are looking for this policy shift, they seem to want to do it behind the scenes. Kairos, I mean, this is not an arm's length organization, as I understand it. This is an independent organization that the government just happened to fund. And the government declined their funding request. And controversy ensued. And Bev Oda, who's the minister in charge of CETA, said, oh, it's just because, you know, it's nothing to do with Israel, it's because Kairos didn't fit our objectives, our priorities.
Do you have reason to dispute that?
Well, I have reason to dispute that because Jason Kenney then went to Israel and spoke at a conference on anti-Semitism and basically said in so many words that he believed Kairos was anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and that's why he cut off the funding. Then people here got a hold of it and said, well, hang on, that's not what you're saying in Canada. And he came back and denied what he'd said. The speech is there. It's obvious what he said. Denied what he'd said. And now he goes around saying, oh, well, no, I didn't cut off the funding and he didn't lose the funding because they were anti-Israeli, but I do think they're anti-Israeli, so they don't deserve funding. This is just, it fits a pattern, is what I'm saying, of a perfectly legitimate objective that they seem to be determined to pursue underhandedly.
Well, let me put that to Payam Akhavan. Do you agree that the government, through its agencies, boards, and commissions, has the right to pursue whatever it perceives to be its goals and agenda of the day, and therefore that this is all perfectly consistent with a government that wants to have, frankly, a more pro-Israeli position on the Middle East than previous governments?
I don't think it's as simple as that. First of all, we have to understand that the idea of being pro-Israeli is not necessarily a question of representing a very narrow political perspective in Israel. For example, B'Tselem, which, as I said, is the leading Israeli human rights organization, the grant which was repudiated. B'Tselem is highly respected in Israel. The Judge Advocate General of the Israeli Armed Forces, in a recent interview in Haaretz, praised B'Tselem's investigative work in uncovering wrongdoing by Israeli forces. And that's the function of non-governmental organizations, to be critical of governments. By the same token, Gerald Steinberg's NGO Monitor was recently called in a Jerusalem Post op-ed by Professor Newman of Ben-Gurion University as blatantly political. It has blacklisted organizations including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, the Central Mennonite Committee. So the point is that one can be sympathetic to Israel, without having this highly politicized perspective, which I actually think does more harm than good, because it does not show the complex democratic nature of Israeli society, in which there are very, very different perspectives. What we're seeing is really a very narrow right-wing Israeli perspective, which I really don't think is keeping with the nature of an independent human rights organization.
Well, Paul, let me bring you in at this point, because that's, I guess, one of the nubs of this story that we want to get to, which is, well, you know, this may be an issue of governance, transparency, and so on that some people talk about on this board. But in fact, at the end of the day, is this a story about another effort by the Conservative government to use the levers at its disposal as the government of the day to advance what it wants to see happen in Canadian government policy, which is a more pro-Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Harper can believe what he wants to about Israel. Here, for the record, is what I believe about Israel. I believe it is a shining example of democracy in a very dangerous part of the world. I believe it absolutely has a right to defend itself, and I believe that in a tough part of the world, it often has to defend itself with its elbows up, and people are going to get hurt. And Israel should get a hell of a lot of the benefit of the doubt. And the weird thing is that I am, in some corners, being depicted as the anti-Israel guy in all of this. But the thing is, to get back to my main point, Harper is free to do to say what he wants, but he's trying something a little trickier. He's appointing people to the board of an arm's-length organization who are going to run this flag way further down the field than he would be comfortable doing in public. And then once they've done that, he's going to send out the biggest buffoon in cabinet, Lawrence Cannon, to protest that he can't do anything about it and he wasn't there and he didn't know. And that way, the policy gets shifted essentially by stealth by a government that is hoping that most of us won't notice, and that the only people who will notice are the people who vote based on the Israel question.
Well, Paul, I'm not here to carry water.
It was going real well until the guy died.
I'm not here to carry water for the cabinet minister involved here, but you know, his first reaction was to say, it's an arm's-length organization, I don't have any involvement in this. He did then, I guess, about a week later say, okay, I've been asked to clean it up and that's what I'm going to do. And that's his position today, isn't it?
His first reaction was to ignore a letter from Remy Beauregard last November, which was in fact the third letter from various board members and management members at Rights and Democracy saying, you've got a hell of a mess in Montreal, maybe you'd like to pay attention to it. He spent 2009 ignoring the problem at Rights and Democracy, and then when Beauregard died inconveniently, he finally, more than a month later, decided to get up off his butt. That doesn't strike me as the work of a responsible cabinet minister.
Okay, let me read this.
No, as a matter of fact, it strikes me as the work of a duplicitous cabinet minister.
Get off the fence, Paul. Tell me what you really think. No, okay, I'm moving on here. I want to talk, I actually want to quote some of Chris's editorial in the National Post now, and then I'll get David Matus to comment on this first. Here's what Chris wrote, apropos of what we're talking about here. Amidst the shrieks and howls from the Canadian left, one principle very much bears repeating. The government is perfectly entitled to appoint people who are, say, supporters of Israel or evangelical Christians to the boards of the various organizations it funds, just like the Liberals were, just like the Progressive Conservatives were when they created Rights and Democracy in 1988. Foreign policy is what the duly elected government of the day wants it to be, and this government is just as entitled to shape it and to appoint its cronies as its predecessor governments were. David Matus, you got any problem with any of that?
I think it's unfair to call us cronies of the government. The people who wrote the performance review report, Elliot Tepper and Jacques Gauthier, were appointed in 2008, the same time as Payam Akhavan. The grants to the three organizations were made in 2009. So these people who wrote the critical performance review report were appointed way before the grants were made, and they certainly weren't appointed with their views on the grants or even the views of rights and democracy in the Middle East, because they don't have a Middle East program. I think what Chris said earlier is correct, that people see a pattern. They're trying to impose a pattern on this organization that simply isn't there. This is not the same thing as Kairos. This is not the cutting off of funding to an organization because it does something of which the government disapproves. This is a dispute about governance in the structure of the organization. I reject what Payam says, that when he was part of a majority, 6-5, that was democracy, but as soon as the vote changes 7-6, it becomes a one-party state.
Well, let me follow up with Payam on that, because one of the things that we've read in the newspapers about this is that in a very nasty world where human rights are being abused in many, many different places, the allegation was by, I think, the board member, Elliot Tepper, that 80% of the focus was on human rights abuses by Israel, which he felt was out of whack with what's going on in the rest of the world. Is that an accurate statement in your view?
I think Mr. Tepper is referring to the United Nations, not to rights and democracy. As Mr. Mates said, we have no Middle East program in rights and democracy, which even makes it more unusual that so much of the criticism against the president was because of this very minor grant to these organizations and because of his mere presence at a meeting in Cairo, which became the basis for accusing him of having ties with Hezbollah. This is the issue. Now, with respect to the United Nations, I was at the United Nations this Monday in a session dealing with Iran's human rights record. And everybody who knows about my background knows that I've lobbied against Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial and incitement to hatred and human rights violations. And I can tell you that I was astonished when I came back to realize that on the same day, Rights and Democracy Board decided to shut the UN office in Geneva. This is a cause for celebration for every tyrannical regime at the United Nations.
What was the explanation behind shutting it down?
I'm sorry?
What was the explanation that they gave for shutting it down?
Well, I think what you explain now, that Mr. Tepper's view and the view of many, including myself, that the United Nations is often engaging in an Israel-bashing exercise. They don't talk about what's happening in Zimbabwe or Sudan and constantly adopt resolutions against Israel. But that's not a reason to abandon the UN Human Rights Council. That's a forceful reason to help empower non-governmental organizations who can speak truth to power, which is what our group of Iranian NGOs was doing against the lies and deception of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay,
so
Chris wants a follow-up here in Toronto.
Well, I just want to say that these are all incredibly important questions, but I'm picturing someone who doesn't know anything about this listening to this debate. And I don't want to drag us off topic, but another thing I mentioned in my editorial was the idea that, I mean, I believe Mr. Akhavan referred to Rights and Democracy as an NGO, and he said that the role of an NGO is to criticize the government. Well, what we're seeing here is that that's only true up to the point that the government lets it happen. And I think there's sort of an elephant in the room here, which is an NGO. I mean, it's right there in the name, non-governmental. And if all of an organization's funding comes from the government,
it's not much of an NGO.
It's not much of an NGO, and I think that we're seeing here sort of the limits of what this can do, and I think it's definitely worth asking whether this sort of organization just isn't right, or
Well, let me follow up even further with Paul here, which is some people have taken this situation, this saga. What did you call it? This sordid saga is what Chris called it, and have said, you know what? This actually casts a negative light on the way the government makes some of its most significant appointments, and therefore we need to change the way some of these appointments are made so that we don't get into these small p political brouhahas so often. Do you think that needs to happen?
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of sort of organizational changes that could be made. I'm not a big fan of Chris Selley's conclusion that might as well just shut Rights and Democracy down. Because I do think that it does interesting and useful work around the world.
Well, it doesn't need to be shut down, but it can be funded in a different way.
Take the government funding away from it and let them get their money elsewhere.
Yeah.
Except that 90% of the budget's from the government, so that kind of effectively shuts it down.
Well, other NGOs get money from places they manage.
Sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the Red Cross gets money from folks like me. There's all kinds of ways to do it. I guess all I can say is that cutting it loose, shutting it down, would be a lot better than the charade that has been going on for the last several months, where members of the Board of Rights and Democracy sick a compliant reporter in Washington who writes for the National Post and for David Frum's website on the Geneva office and say, why don't you go and see whether they're doing good work at the Geneva office? And they forget to tell them the Geneva office is closed because they're awaiting a performance review. And Buddy goes off and has his friends knock on the door in Geneva and no one answers, and he comes back and says, oh, there's a scandal. And then the board shuts the Geneva office down. And the whole thing was kabuki theater. I'd really rather see Rights and Democracy cut loose than see it subjected to this kind of silliness.
Okay, I got a minute left.
And then they send out Mr. Matus to say there's nothing wrong.
Well, let me give him the last word. Let me give him the last word, because we got a minute left here, David Matus, and obviously, if you've been watching all the way through on this program, you may come to the conclusion that this is an organization that is so dysfunctional it's beyond repair. What would you say on that, and whether this organization in fact does have a constructive future to play?
Well, the programs themselves are very useful and should continue. The question is whether this is an appropriate vehicle of delivery. I don't think we can have an organization where we're just basically hiring people off the street to run their own agenda at government money with no direction from the board. That can't happen. The structure that's in place needs to allow the board to do what the statute says it should do, which is to control and manage the place. But if we're going to have staff that insist on taking this organization in their own direction without any supervision, without any accountability, without any transparency, I don't see how it can continue.
How'd you like to have your next board meeting on TVO?
Sure.
Sure?
The CBO? What's CBO?
No, on TVO. Have it on our television channel.
Oh, you mean have the next board meeting on
Yeah,
TVO?
televise it on TVO. What would you say to that?
On TVO, well, I have no objections personally. I mean, it's not up for me to decide, but I
Perfect.
personally...
I'm seconding the idea, and we'll take it up at the next meeting. Can I thank all of our guests for appearing tonight on this program? Paul Wells from Maclean's Magazine in Vancouver, David Matus from Rights and Democracy in Winnipeg, Payam Akhavan, the former board member from Rights and Democracy in Montreal, Chris Selley from the National Post here in Toronto. Thanks very much, everybody.